think there's going to be there's going to have to be a change in where the funding comes from, and that's clear. NIH for a long time, not just in gene therapy, has had great difficulty funding clinical trials. They can fund end research very well, quite successful, have always had trouble funding clinical trials because, of course, as you get into clinical trials and developing therapeutics, that's where you start spending the money.
Sure.
Number one. Number two, and with condensed budget or tightened budgets, it becomes even harder to do that. So I think the funding, there has to be additional sources for clinical trial funding. It's very hard up front to attract large pharma, big pharma, and right now big pharma, the R&D guys, if they're paying attention to gene therapy, can't usually get attention paid by their senior management, the executive committee, the portfolio committees. They haven't yet really cottoned on to the fact that this technology can work. And so they tend to be reluctant to change, and a lot of these companies are the old, if it's a pill in a bottle, I can sell it, you know. So I think, nevertheless, I think there's a way to, if you could have an integrated funding system, it could be designed to also include certainly the earlier stage companies that are involved in this field in a much more overt way and get them involved. They can be very helpful in many cases. I think the other terrific helpful source are the disease foundations. And over probably the last 10 years, many disease foundations have become much more savvy in what they do with the funds they raise. They have become quite expert at clinical development themselves. Frequently, they're a great source of the patient population, number one. They're frequently a source of assembling clinicians that are involved in treating these patients. So they can be a great source of clinical advice for data safety monitoring boards. They can be terrific fundraisers. And I think they can be enormously helpful, not only in funding, say, the early stage research or young investigators to get them into their disease area, but help fund clinical trials. And in fact, a fair number of disease foundations that are non-profits are actually now setting up separate arms designed specifically for clinical trial funding.
Oh.
And it has to do in part with the fact that they're non-profits and they're trying to separate liability. It's the same thing that Dave, once you start doing clinical trials, there's product liability issues and research harm issues. So a lot of the foundations are beginning or have set up another entity, which is essentially a business entity to fund and conduct, say, the research to enable a clinical trial or to do the trial, separate from the foundation itself. And it has to do with simply so that the liability is in that entity and the money is over here. But this is simply this is not new. In fact, the CF Foundation did this a long time ago, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. But many foundations are doing that. A lot of other foundations, there are foundations or disease-oriented groups have set up, and they are essentially running sort of like a mini biotech in which they are funding work and maintaining intellectual property rights because they want to make sure that stuff really gets developed and becomes available for the public. There's a Huntington's disease, the CDHI involved in Huntington's disease is an example of that type of organization. And many of these groups now, aside from having peer-reviewed grant systems in many cases, they have real development expertise. They understand what you need to do to file an IND to start a clinical trial and how to follow up. So I think that's a real role for foundations. And in many cases, and I know particularly for pediatric diseases, and a large number of the diseases we hear are pediatric, some of these foundations are very effective at fundraising. So that's one thing. The other big challenge, I think, is in the big diseases like heart failure. Now, we heard Barrie Burns summarized some of those heart failure trials, and Celadon's trial, for instance, has gone through its phase 2. The big issue was how are we going to move some of these things to phase 3 in areas which are large disease areas, but where there's a very entrenched system for treating cardiovascular disease. There's the physicians who treat it, there's the insurance companies that pay for it, and there's the big pharmas that develop the pills, for your blood pressure. And a lot of that system has enormous inertia and doesn't want to move from that. So it's really hard to get, and I think that's going to be true for a lot of these big multigenic disease areas. Not for cancer, because I think that's a different story, but But things like heart disease and some of the big areas like that, it's going to be hard for gene therapy to break through, and I think we're going to need, I think for that to move might need help, not only from the society trying to help. I think that's a place where NIH could be quite effective. For instance, you would imagine Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, that's one of their biggest franchises, heart disease. So it's easy to focus on the rare diseases with a single gene in a few patients. It's much harder as it gets bigger.
I see. And
the trials get very big, and conventionally those trials. So that's an example of a complete. So I think there's a whole, and then eventually I think if NIH can maintain the involvement and somehow roll in even the smaller companies, and they can roll in and work with foundations, and have the foundations are going to have to supply a lot of money. I think pretty soon the real funding is going to have to come from larger biotech and larger pharma, and it may take a bit of time, but some of them, there's beginning to be movement there. And you just heard that GSK signed the agreement with the Milan Group, and actually, I'm not sure Maria quite mentioned, GSK made a strategic decision that they were going to do rare diseases in whatever shape or form. And having done that and looked around, it became instantly obvious to them here was a group in Italy with an approach that was gene therapy that could address a whole bunch of those. So that's a case where I think the guys in Milan were able to opportunely roll into what was a strategic plan for a big pharma who had made a decision not to do gene therapy but to do rare diseases. And that's a big opportunity because most large pharma now are beginning to come back and look at rare diseases, recognizing you can't have a blockbuster drug overnight, that there are ways to address rare disease now with good technologies and have very effective therapies. And actually there's even a move, a lot of big pharma are beginning to think about cancer as essentially a set of rare or orphan diseases, because once we start understanding the molecular causes of individual cancers, a lot of sort of big groups of cancer can be divided into a set of different diseases with a quite different root cause. You can have a very molecularly targeted therapeutic for that molecule. And if there's less than 200,000 patients, then it's moving towards a strategy of addressing all these as that. It's what's coming out of the idea if we have biomarkers and we identify for diseases that this particular disease is associated with this actual gene over here. Even though we think that's a multigenic disease, then you can classify, and there are substantial advantages for things approved as orphan drugs because you can have market exclusivity and whatever. So I think that's driving a lot of it, but it's taking time to roll the big players in. But I think the way to start is with foundations and with the smaller companies, try to maintain NIH and have a funding system that allows this to be rolled together. And eventually I think that it's beginning to move. And I think the big farmers inside a few years will be much more active players.